Hello and welcome to the first of our lecture series here in the membership channel. Today's lecture is going to be all about yarn weights and what you want to know about them. So grab a beverage, buckle in, grab your knitting or your crocheting, and get ready to learn quite a bit about yarn weights. Okay. So there are quite a few different weights of yarn, and there are multiple ways of denoting those weights of yarn. And you may be thinking, doesn't a pound of yarn weigh the same as a pound of something else? You would be correct, but that's not what we're talking about when we say yarn weight. So yarn weight, contrary to popular belief, has nothing to do with the weight of the ball or skein of yarn that you are getting when you're buying it at the store. The actual physical weight is not what we're talking about. When we say yarn weight, either in a pattern or at your local yarn store or craft store, what we're saying is technically the diameter or the thickness of the yarn, but it is considered to be the weight of the yarn. So if you are familiar with commercial yarn brands or yarn at big box stores, you're used to a put up in either some form of a bullet put up. And typically, those yarns will have this symbol or a form of this symbol on it, which will be a number system 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Now, the number system isn't always universal, and that can be a little bit tricky. We have seen that typically the number system is most common through the United States, but again, with it not being truly standardized, one number doesn't necessarily always guaranteed to mean the same thing across yarn brands. That being said, it is a general guideline, I would say, if you're going by the number system. So, for example, a number 4 pretty much always means a worsted or Aran weight yarn. So in this case, this is a worsted weight yarn, and it has the number 4 written on it. Number 3s are considered typically to be a DK weight yarn. DK simply means double knit, and it comes from the British term because they would call a knit fabric a fingering weight fabric. We'll get to that term in a minute. And if it was double knit, that was double the thickness, and that's where we get DK from. So DK typically means a number 3, or relates to the number 3 in the number system, and it's going to be slightly thinner than a worsted weight. And I'm going to go over all of these here in just a second, but I wanted to just give you an overview. A number 2 typically means a sport, but it can also mean fingering in the number system. And then you have a number 1, which sometimes is just called very fine, which again can be anything from a fingering weight to a lace weight yarn. 5 and 6 are used kind of interchangeably as bulky, chunky, or super bulky. When you get into those really large thicknesses, there's not really any sort of standardization in the industry, and so chunky sometimes is the same as bulky. Sometimes chunky is a little bit thinner than bulky. Super bulky typically is always the thickest, but that's just kind of a bit of a, you really got to go by the gauge listed or the recommended needle size. There's some exceptions to that too, but we'll get to that in a minute. So I want to start off with number 1, or what I'm going to refer to primarily now as the names. The names are a little bit more specific, a bit more technical, and a little bit more universal also. You will typically find when you are shopping at a craft-specific store outside of a big box store. So whether that be a local yarn store, a craft store that has multiple hobbies, things like that aren't a big box store, you're going to find the signage in the store and typically a lot of the labels stating the name versus a number for the weight. An example here would be the back of this label. So this tells you that it is, right, it's tiny print, sport weight right on there. It does not give a number system. So typically that's where in a yarn store or hobby store, craft store, you can always ask for help with the people that are working there, and they'll be able to guide you for that specific yarn weight. They can usually translate as well from the number system if that's what you're used to. And don't be afraid to ask, because that's what they're there to do, is to help you guys. So we're going to again start off with lace weight. So lace weight yarn, I have a few examples. Lace weight is going to be the finest yarn typically. There are a few exceptions with thread weights. We're not even going to get into that. But lace weight yarn, you can see, is a very, very thin diameter. Typically, as you can see on here, it says right on it, lace weight yarn. Typically, if you're having a 50-gram ball or hank of yarn, this is not, I shouldn't have shown that, 50 gram, there we go. You're going to have in a lace weight around anywhere from 400 to 500 yards in a 50-gram put up. And if it was a 100-gram put up, anywhere from around 650 to 850 total yardage in your skein. That can also help you in a couple different ways. It can denote if it's a heavy lace weight, a fine lace weight, or potentially if that lace weight is going to bloom on you. Now, if that all sounds like Greek, it's fine. You'll learn those terms soon, and I hopefully at the end of this you're not totally confused. But basically, a yarn will typically, as you knit with it and as you block it and you have your finished fabric, the yarn blocking, steam blocking, wet blocking, especially in your natural fibers, allow the yarn to fully bloom. So if you think about it, yarn, when it's spun up, it's put under stress because it has energy put into it with the spinning process. It's washed, it's dyed, it's steam set, it's pressure set. It's all these different things are happening to it that applies stress and pressure to the yarn. And then of course, when you put it into a ball, if it's not already in ball form, if it's in a hank form, then you're winding it into a ball, you're knitting or crocheting with it. Maybe you're a really tight knitter. Maybe you're having to do something at a tight gauge. And it applies stress and pressure to the yarn. So when you block it and steam it, it really allows those fibers to relax, to breathe, and to quote unquote set. And that's when you're going to get your accurate measurement of your gauge, because the yarn will have then bloomed, if that yarn is going to be a bloomer or not. Typically, that's why you do a gauge swatch, is to see, is this a yarn that is already pre-bloomed? Is it going to bloom more on you? Is it going to really relax and give you a beautiful drapey fabric? Is it going to relax but kind of firm up and give you really great stitch definition and structure? So that's a great reason to play around with your yarn and get a feel for it and its properties before diving straight into your pattern. So again, lace weight yarn is the most fine. You're going to find it in, I'll say, a typical, just a very fine thread, maybe a merino wool. This one happens to be a rambouillet. This one happens to be some recycled fibers. This one also, I would actually denote this to be a heavy lace. So there is a little bit of that. You can get into the weeds with that, honestly, but that's where going to a yarn store will be helpful when you're picking out your pattern. And then you're also going to have a fluffy lace weight. So in this case, like a mohair, or this is a silk mohair. Sometimes you can have just a silk thread that is a lace weight as well. You may have a silk alpaca that's a brushed, or even a camel. You could have a camel. You could also have, cashmere. That's brushed and gives you that fluff, but this would still be considered a lace weight yarn. So those are all examples of lace weight yarn. You will typically find that mohair or alpaca lace weight fibers like this are put into 25-gram balls. So if you pull this up and you're like, oh, but the yardage on this is only like, in this case, 480, this is actually a 20-gram ball. It's because it's either 20-gram or 25-gram ball. I would say 25 is kind of more popular here in the States. This one is from Europe, so it's a 20-gram ball. But keep that in mind when you're looking at yardage, or if you're going by a pattern that calls for gram weights, in mohairs especially. Be mindful, because sometimes it'll be like, oh, why is it taking so many balls of mohair? It could be that it's just a 20-gram or a 25-gram ball versus a 50-gram or even a 100-gram skein. So that is lace weight. Just because it says lace weight does not mean that's what you have to use to knit a lace pattern. I will say the majority of your lace designs, so lace shawls, lace blankets, things like that, nowadays, typically on the patterns you're going to find in Ravelry, are actually knit in a fingering or sock yarn. It's easier to work with. It's a little less fiddly, and there's more options typically available either on the internet or at your local craft store than lace weight. Lace weight, at least in the States and especially in certain pockets, is kind of fallen out a little bit because it is fiddly, it's super fine, you usually have to use very small needles, and people just don't typically like to work with it by itself. So if you're having trouble finding lace weight yarn, that may be the case in your area, and you may need to find it online. Okay, next one would be fingering and sock weight yarn. So fingering and sock are the exact same thickness. So again, we're talking about thickness when we talk about weight. The main difference between a fingering and a sock weight yarn is the content of the yarn. So in this case, I have a sock yarn. You can see the thickness. Now let me compare that to a strand here. Oops. Of the lace weight. You can see the diameter thickness difference. So we've got a sock weight yarn. Sock yarn has some percentage of a nylon typically in it. This case, this is a 10% nylon, 90% superwash yarn. And that's what denotes it to be a sock yarn. Now, you don't have to use nylon for your socks. You can use 100% wool, or you could use something that has instead a ramie added to it, or a silk, or even a mohair component if you are wanting to stay away from nylon. But typically that is what the difference between it saying sock weight and fingering weight is. Purely the sock weight has nylon added, but it is the same diameter. This is another example of a fingering weight yarn. So again, this would be a number 1 typically in the number system. This is a single ply yarn. So you can see here it's a little bit fuzzy looking, and that's because it is a single ply, and it just typically has that look to it. It's the same thickness as this, whereas this has multiple plies of yarn, so like several different strands of lace twisted together to create a single strand. Pull this up and you can see if we were to pull apart the end here and untwist it. This is very highly twisted, so it's great. But if we were, you could see we're working with 2 separate strands in one. So this is a plied yarn, which does make it stronger. But the benefit of using something that's a single ply yarn is the drape. You can already see in this, it's beautiful. It drapes gorgeously. It also has that little bit of fuzz. So if you're wanting a little bit of a fuzzy texture without adding a mohair, a single ply typically is a great option. That can also be from the content of your yarn. So if it had like an alpaca content or a cashmere content, it can also typically have that halo around it as well. But single ply fingering is the same weight and diameter as a plied sock yarn. You can also have a plied fingering yarn such as this. This is just a straight up 100% merino wool, no nylon added, but it does have a nice high twist, so you could definitely use it for socks. You don't have to have the nylon in it, but it's going to be the same thickness. So if you have a pattern that you're looking for that says sock weight yarn, you could easily pretty much use any of these with the exception of the single ply if you are actually knitting true socks. Single ply doesn't have that extra strength from the plies, and so it's not recommended. But any other pattern, if you're working for a shawl, you could use any of these. You could mix them all together in your shawl as well, or your sweater. You don't have to separate plied versus non-plied versus nylon versus without nylon. You can mix and match as long as it's the same weight within your pattern. Especially if that's the case if you find you want a solid, commercial dyed for the majority of your sweater, but you want to add some fun pops of hand dyed yarns, you can mix and match those bases. So fingering weight and sock weight all around a number 1, and all fabulous options for you to knit or crochet with. Moving on, the next weight of yarn is sport weight yarn. So sport weight, remember I showed this earlier, sport weight is going to be kind of the next level up in thickness. So as you can see here, put that out, you can see it's a bit thicker, not quite as thick as a DK weight. This is another remnant of a sport weight yarn. You can see this one is nice and highly twisted in its plies. So sport weight yarn typically, oh, I forgot to mention this, sock weight yarns typically will have anywhere from around 3, for 100 gram skein, 380 to 490 yards typically on 100 gram skein. So they can typically be sold in 20 gram, 25, 50, 100 grams. Sometimes you'll even find 115 or even 200 gram skeins, just depending on the manufacturer. But that is your typical length for that weight of yarn. So for a sport weight yarn, you're going to typically have around 300 to about 350. So you can see it's a little bit thicker than the sport weight. That's for 100 gram. And then you can see that thickness as well. So this is a 2-ply sport, and it's not a high twist, but it's still beautiful yarn. This one would bloom beautifully when you swatch it, FYI. So sport weight yarns typically are used for garments, some shawls out there as well, but they make for a fabulous garment, especially when you are dealing with a little bit looser gauge and you don't want a thick, heavy fabric. You can usually drop down to a sport weight yarn instead of a DK in your pattern and still get a really nice garment, and it just be a little bit lighter weight for your climate. So then the next one will be a DK weight. So DK weight again is most typically associated with the number 3. So DK weight, you can see we're getting a bit thicker here. This one happens to be a blend of plant and animal fibers, so it's a wool cotton blend. You've got this big, beautiful, gorgeous yarn here. Again, a DK weight. This one is interesting because this yarn is a 100% American Cormo. It blooms beautifully. So on here, you have approximately 250 yards, which I would say most of your DK yarns are going to have around 230 to around 275, I would say, roughly, for most DK weights for 100 gram skein. But you notice on here it gives a range for needle gauge sizing. So a DK weight yarn can be used for multiple weights and gauges. Typically, you might hear a lot of people say you need to knit a DK weight on, say, a 22 stitch gauge or 21 stitch gauge. You can totally do that. I will show you just a second here a fabric that has that 21 stitch gauge, but you can also knit it a bit looser, especially for warmer climate zones like where we are in Texas, that allow the yarn to really bloom and blossom and breathe and give you a beautifully drapey, lovely fabric without it being so dense and so heavy and so hot potentially as well. Obviously, if you're in a very cold climate, you want that denser gauge to keep you warm and functional in the garment. If you're like us and you just have air conditioning to deal with typically, then you want that little bit looser, more breathable fabric. So bear that in mind. DK also comes in a few different types. This you'll see is like a flecked yarn. So this is considered a tweed. It's most common in DK. It does come in fingering weight as well, but typically you see a tweed in a DK. And these little nubs of yarn, they're called neps actually, they don't change the gauge that you're knitting it. So it still is going to be a DK weight yarn. Another fun textural example would be a boucle. And so DK boucle right now at the timing of this video is pretty popular. And so you can see it looks to be almost a tiny bit thicker, but in reality it's not. It just has that twisty, fun boucle texture to it. So it will knit up at a DK weight gauge, but you have that fun textural element in addition to the beautiful color of the yarn. So like I said, this is a sweater that is being knit up at a 21 stitch gauge in DK weight yarn. So it's nice, tight, it's a dense fabric. I say dense, it's not stiff. It's still beautiful, but it is pretty tight in terms of gauge. So it's a 21 stitch gauge for DK versus a pattern like this. Now this is a bit darker, so I hope you can see this. But this, I don't know, in the sun you might be able to see kind of a shadowing. You can slightly see my hand through it. So this is a DK weight yarn, but it's knit at a looser stitch gauge. So this is a 19 stitch gauge. So there's a little more fabric breathability in this one, and it just gives you a little bit looser, drapier overall. And you can see in the single layer, it's a bit more see-through than that other one. This one, you can't see through the fabric at all. So that's kind of a cheat sheet on gauge. That's why I encourage you to play with your yarn, especially if you're using a new to you yarn. Once you've worked with a yarn before, do you need to truly gauge swatch? I'm going to leave that up to you. But the first time I ever get a yarn in my hands, I always like to do a gauge swatch. I want to see how the yarn behaves. I want to see, is it a really great structural yarn? Is it a really nice soft and drapey yarn? Does it bloom? Does it give me, that drape and that luxurious feel? What does the yarn want to be? So I really appreciate that and from gauge swatching. So I want to go on in the yarn weights more before we talk a little bit more about gauge. So worsted weight is next, which would be a number 4. So worsted weight yarns comes in a variety of put-ups. Again, you might be more commonly associated with the bullet form or in the skein form. Either way, worsted weight is going to be your thicker yarn. As you can see here, it's a bit thicker than the DK. Typically, it's going to have around 190 to 220 yards per 100 grams, and it's going to be recommended usually at a 16 to 22 stitch gauge for that gauge. Again, personal preference on what you want to do. I love a good worsted weight yarn. Now you might look at that and say, oh, that looks thinner. So this is a worsted weight yarn that has had so much tension put on it in spinning and everything else that before you to really truly realize its potential, it has to be blocked. So what that means is you just need to do a gauge swatch before you knit with it and see how much the stitches bloom. So in this case, they bloom quite a bit and it leaves a beautiful, beautiful finished object. But you want to bear that in mind as you are knitting with it. It's going to look a little bit different as you knit until you bloom it, till you block it. Bloom it. Why not? Call it that. It's fine. This is another one. This actually has had a little bit of steam popped on it, so you can see it's plumped up beautifully. And I actually have my finished sweater here in that yarn, and it's a gorgeous, gorgeous stitch definition. So this is a worsted weight, and it's done at a 16 stitch gauge, and you can just see a really nice fabric, not too tight, beautiful, but also not see-through either. So it's not a see-through fabric at all. I have another sweater. This is a more heathered kind of fabric, but again, worsted weight, done at a 16 stitch gauge. So you can see beautiful, beautiful fabric. This is a fabric that if you knit it tighter, it will be more stiff, but done at that 16 stitch gauge, it is a bit more kind of like a sweatshirt fabric. So just depending on the finished object that you're wanting is what you're going to get. So then this is also a worsted weight, but this is done at a bit tighter gauge. So the fabric is a little bit stiffer. It's hard to show on the camera because it doesn't look like it, but this one is done at a 20 stitch gauge. So a worsted weight done at a 20 stitch gauge. You can see though that gives us this really crisp stitch definition in these mock cables. And so I just wanted to show you the difference, especially with a textural stitch like this, that in a tighter gauge, you're going to get a little bit more of that crisp stitch definition. Last yarn weight to chat about, and I'm going to lump these a little bit all together, and that's bulky weight. So chunky, bulky, super bulky, they all can kind of blend together a bit, but they're all super fun. So as you can see here, this bulky weight may not look super bulky. It kind of looks honestly a little bit like a worsted, but the nature of this, once you start knitting with it, it's a blown yarn. So you have a cotton core tube that the fibers are blown into, so you get that beautiful halo effect. This definitely knits up at a much bulkier gauge. So a 13, 14, 15 stitch gauge is what you want for this to let this yarn really shine and show off that nice fuzzy texture. Same with this. So this is Spin Cycle Plump. You have that beautiful, nice high twist on it. You get that color gradation. But again, this is a bulky weight yarn. It's 100 yards for the skein. And you're going to get, this is a 100 gram skein. So bulky yarns, typically you're going to get anywhere from say 90 to 100 and maybe 40, depending on if it's like a bulky, a super bulky, or a chunky for your 100 gram skein. So something like this, the Luft, you're getting 109. This you're getting right at 100. Things like that. This is another one. This yarn, again, looks a little bit finer, but it plumps and bulks up beautifully. So this is still a bulky weight yarn, even though it may not look like it right out of the ball. So again, that's another reason you want to swatch a little bit. And then you have this yarn. So this is a super bulky. And again, you can definitely tell this one's a super bulky or a bulky because of the nice tight twist to the plies, and it shows off your stitch definition very, very well. So those are the different yarn weights. Now again, about gauge swatching. So this is an example. This is a stitch pattern that I did in worsted weight, and you can see it's a bit dense, but it is beautiful. But this is done at a 20 stitch gauge. So I measured across in my pattern 20 stitches for 4 inches, and that has been washed and blocked. And then here is what I ended up going with, because my pattern called for a 16 stitch for 4 inches. and that's what I got with this. So I had to go up a needle size to get that, but you can see the stitch patterning is still gorgeous in that 16 stitch versus a 20 stitch. Just gives you a little bit of a different look, but mostly what this does is it would give you a different fit. So if I had continued to knit my sweater with this gauge, because it is tighter and there are more stitches within that 4 inches, that means my sweater would have been much tighter than what it should have been when I knitted it at the end. So that's the importance of gauge. I am going to film a lecture series on gauge specific, talking about gauge, what the difference between stitch gauge and row gauge is, and all that, coming up very soon. So stay tuned if you're interested in gauge. This was really just a little bit on gauge, but mostly about the different weights of yarn. I would say knit with whatever weight you enjoy at the end of the day. A lot of us, I think, at the end of the day have a preference of a yarn weight that we love to knit with, or a range. I personally love to knit with DK Sport and fingering. That's my sweet spot. But everyone has their preference. Some people really love knitting with the chunky, bulky, and worsted weight yarns. Some people really love knitting with the lace weight by themselves, or things like that. The other cool thing you can do with yarn weights is you can mix and match. So if you hold 2 strands of fingering weight together, that's going to equal the gauge of DK. If you hold 2 strands of lace weight together, that's going to equal fingering. If you hold a strand of lace, like a mohair, with a strand of sport, you're going to get a DK to worsted. And you will notice a lot of patterns will call for a sock weight yarn and a sock weight yarn or fingering weight yarn with a strand of mohair, and that's going to then equal, quote unquote, a DK weight. And you may think, well, if 2 strands of sock equal DK, how does a thinner strand and this? It's because of the fluffiness of the mohair fills in the gaps in the stitches, and that's what creates that same DK gauge. So for example, this sweater that I showed earlier was done, it's a DK weight gauge, but it's done with a strand of fingering and a strand of mohair. So you can see a little bit of that halo effect right in there, and just the beautiful drape you get from the silk and the nice loose gauge there. That's the only one I mixed. So that's a fun way of mixing and matching. You can also do 2 strands of DK to equal a heavy worsted to a light bulky. You can hold a strand of DK with a strand of mohair for a worsted weight. You can hold 2 strands of sport together for about a worsted weight to maybe a little bit heavier depending on the 2 strands of sport. You could also throw in a mohair with 2 strands of sport to equal a bulky or chunky. The main thing you want to consider when you are picking out your pattern is what weight does it call for, what stitch gauge is it calling for, and then go from there on if you're going to modify. So if your pattern calls for a DK weight yarn at a 20 stitch gauge, but you see from the pictures it's very light and breezy and it doesn't have cables, it doesn't have lace, it's just a stockinette fabric, then you could easily do a strand of fingering and a strand of mohair to equal that 20 stitch gauge. You could easily pick a DK weight that you like and do it at that 20 stitch gauge. You could even, if maybe you're in a warmer climate or you're very cold natured and you're like, I have this worsted weight that I really love and I really want to use and I like the fabric it gives me at 20 stitch gauge, then you can use a worsted weight, even though that pattern technically called for a DK. You can make those little modifications as long as you're getting the stitch count and the stitch gauge that it's called for. You won't have to make modifications to the pattern. If you don't, but you still want to move forward, that's going to be another video that's coming soon on modifying the size that you're knitting of a garment to fit the gauge of the fabric that you like. Again, that's coming soon, so stay tuned for that. Other than that, that's about all I have for you today for weights of yarn. I hope this has been helpful and informative for you, and we will be putting forth new lectures every few weeks, and hope you enjoy. So stay tuned. Have a great rest of your day. Happy crafting, happy knitting, happy crocheting, and happy playing with yarn. Bye, guys.